Good afternoon and welcome to the second episode of Policy Crossroads by the European Policy Centre. I'm Garvan, Walshe, Head of Communications, and we're very privileged today to have with us today Sara Matthieu, MEP from the Green Group, and Brooke, Policy Analyst at the EPC. Today's topic is going to be climate change and the backlash. We've all seen the farmers' protests, we've all seen the controversy over the nature restoration law, and we have brought you together to talk about is there a disconnect here between the European institutions and the public? Is there something that we can do to bring the public back on side? And how can we get over this bump? Because if we're going to deal with climate change, we need a sustained policy consensus that's got to last throughout several political cycles. It's perhaps a unique and particularly devilish challenge for democratic political systems. So if I could start with you, Ms. Matthieu, and ask what you think about this argument that there is a growing disconnect between the public and the environmental movement, or between the need to address climate change. First of all, is this even true? Do you think there is such a disconnect?
I don't think there's a disconnect with the general public, honestly. I mean, also if you look at polls, it's not something that I'm just, thinking from the top of my head. You see that a lot of people are still quite, worried about climate change. They know that solutions need to be made, and they are actually looking at the European level to do so. So in that sense, there's a lot of understanding of what needs to be done, and still a lot of support as well. I think what we've seen is not really the general public, but a part, and then of course you were talking about the farmers, a part of our constituencies that are worried if they will still be able to have a decent living if they continue in the agricultural sector, etc. So, I mean, for me, it's not a general backlash against the Green Deal. It's a part of society that is worried about their livelihoods, and I think even rightfully so. If you look at how difficult it is right now for family farmers to still earn a decent living, it's true that there is a problem and we need to solve the problem, but solving the problem is not stepping away from the Green Deal. And I think that that's the big misconception right now. That's really what is used by the agro-industry, by conservatives, by the extreme right, to actually frame it this way and say, but the answer to all of your problems is less green legislation. Whilst if you talk to, for instance, farmers, I mean, they are the first ones who are going to suffer the consequences of climate change and of loss of biodiversity. So it's not so simple in that sense that if you quit all of the Green Deal, then all of a sudden they are out of the woods. It's quite the contrary.
Do you feel that do you feel that the Green Deal is being scapegoated here for other problems, whether it's got to do with energy price rises because of the war, whether it's because of other changes in the international economy?
I mean, if you look at, for instance, I'm a Belgian MEP, the farmers' movement in Wallonia, it's very clear that they are quite angry about trade policy. For instance, about the Mercosur agreement, where they see unfair competition coming up. And I mean, that is really what they are worried about. So it's not that they are protesting the nature restoration law or that they are protesting the Green Deal. So I think there's a problem with our agricultural model for sure. I mean, the way that it is now being construed is that we get a lot of subsidies going to a very small amount of big industry. And that's really one of the root causes, I would say, why a lot of this European money that we have and that we spend on agriculture is not actually helping these small family farms, for instance. So to me, yes, it's a play that some of the extreme right and the conservatives, etc., have used to actually attack the Green Deal. I don't think it's a very fair attack in that sense.
I mean, Brooke, a lot of your work has previously been on the hard right, the extremes, and their involvement in the political process. I mean, do you think that this is also something that they're exploiting? They're exploiting maybe a badly formed common agricultural policy, or do they have wider objections to the European system?
I mean, I think it's fair to say that the far right is co-opting this movement in a sense when they themselves don't have an answer to this question or this issue. With that said, I think I would maybe take a slight different stance and say that it doesn't necessarily mean that there's not a disconnect between the public and the Green Deal or the green transition, and that I completely agree with the point that, the polls show averting climate change is a massive issue for Europeans, and the conversation is less about the merit of the Green Deal and more about how to do the Green Deal. How can we do the Green Deal in a way that brings citizens along? Because maybe not to the same degree as we're seeing with the protests, but there is a disconnect to some degree between citizens and the Green Deal. That is a good example for this, in my mind, is the Social Climate Fund. So with the broadening of the scope of emissions trading schemes with ETS2, there is expected to be a negative impact on vulnerable low-income households through increased living expenses. The Social Climate Fund was introduced as a way to compensate for this by redirecting some of the revenue towards these households, essentially as a way to alleviate transitional growing pains. And this is good. It acknowledges that there are these costs, but that's kind of the predicament with the conversation we're having on how to do the Green Deal, is that we're mentioning that there will be costs, but not necessarily providing clarity or information on how the costs are going to be mitigated and averted and what happens if not. And while I think there's still sentiment that the Green Deal has to happen, there's question as to how it can happen in a way that brings citizens along, because that's not clear.
I mean, as a politician, one of your roles in a representative democracy is to be this kind of bridge between the governing authorities and the citizens. And do you think that the European Parliament has actually done its job here? People on the right might say, well, the nature restoration law was just didn't take people's considerations into account, and that's why the political system responded to that. And as a result of that response, eventually the law was withdrawn. Eventually compromises were made. Isn't that the democratic system working rather than a disconnect?
No, I don't think so, because again, to me, for the bulk of people, there is no problem with the nature restoration law. They actually want to protect nature, and really polls show that. But it's true what you say, that for a lot of people, the preoccupation when it comes to the Green Deal is how are we going to make it affordable, especially for those with slimmer pockets. And that is what I have been working on as a lawmaker. I mean, I was negotiating the Social Climate Fund. I agree it's not going to be enough. It's not big enough to really alleviate that pressure and make sure that all of those vulnerable households do get the support that they need. I mean, this is a stepping stone, as I see it, it's the first time that there's actually European funds going to alleviate energy poverty. This is very important, but it's not going to be enough. And I mean, for me, that's really what we need to do to get the support from the general public, is making sure that the Green Deal has a social heart and that it's not just an afterthought, as was the case with the Social Climate Fund, but it's actually something that is giving people perspective, of hope, that it's giving them a way of bettering themselves, that it is actually fighting social inequalities. And to me, that's really the biggest thing that we need to realize in the next mandate, is to make this all very much more social than it is the case right now, that there's a lot more investments going into social housing renovation, for instance, in making public transport better and more affordable, in actually helping people through this climate transition, which we're not doing right now. I mean, a lot of climate policy is still quite oriented towards people that can actually already afford a house or can afford to apply for subsidies if they want to do an energy renovation or put solar panels on there. And then, of course, it's logical that people are going to feel like they are losing out, whilst it should be the exact opposite. It actually should be the most important lever for them to have a perspective on a warm house, on affordable energy, on a decent job in this whole transition that is a quality job that is local, that is, decently paid, etc. So, I mean, for me, that's really what we need to do to get that popular support.
But if you're talking about these measures, social transfers, more funding for public transport, more funding for job transition schemes, the EU budget is what, a couple of % of the total government spending across the Union. Aren't these mostly things that it's up to member states' government to do? Would they not be unfairly blaming the EU if it were unable to provide measures on the scale that they aren't willing to provide the money to pay for?
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, of course, within the Social Climate Fund, for instance, that was the whole discussion. We wanted to have more dedicated funds specifically for the most vulnerable, whilst member states always want to decide on what to do with the money themselves. And I mean, of course, you're not going to have this big renovation wave that we need if member states are not going to put their money where their mouth is. So indeed, it's not going to be just a question of European funds, but you can help with European funds to make it so. And I mean, with this specific model, and we've used that model before, you have co-financing. So it's the idea that actually member states do chip in and get, well, extra funds if they do. It's a way of pushing them to make sure that they actually do social climate policies.
I mean, Brooke, isn't this one of the big questions? Not only the difference between different member states' levels of income, but also different priorities they may have, because one of the tasks that will happen in the next mandate is, of course, negotiating the next EU budget, the next multi-annual financial framework. There are many big pressures on this, including, not least, for more defense spending. Thierry Breton said he wanted another 100 billion for that. If you have 100 billion here, 100 billion there, as they used to say, you're pretty much talking about real money. How do you see this fight over the budget shaping up?
I mean, it's exactly that challenge. I mean, it's correct. I think the rise of far-right ideology, in my mind, is quite connected to it, not just in the EU, but globally. As we see a threat to democracy within the EU, we're seeing a threat to cohesion, and EU cohesion is imperative for the success, for the adoption and implementation of Green Deal initiatives. When we look, beyond this, globally, there's a rise of geopolitical tensions and uncertainty, and that's changing the landscape of priorities in an unknown way. It's, I would argue, to a very degree dependent on this next institutional cycle that we'll see post-elections. But I think most definitely the role of the Green Deal within this shifting landscape of priorities is increasingly uncertain.
Sarah, what would you say to, for example, your colleagues from Estonia or Poland who are saying, oh, hold on a minute, we're extremely close to the Russian border here. We need to spend more on defense. We'd like some help from the EU. And you're saying, well, that may be true, but we've also got serious environmental problems here. I mean, if you think of your Dutch colleagues, very close by, are extremely low-lying territory. If sea levels rise, they're going to be in significant trouble. How do you balance these priorities?
Yeah, but that's the thing. We are going to need massive investments, for sure. And the weird thing is that a lot of the colleagues here in the parliament, but also in the member states, actually are choosing to go back to austerity measures, which doesn't comply at all with what we need, not on defense and not on investments for the Green Deal, for green industry, etc. So, I mean, for me, that's one of the big questions that lies ahead. Are we going to go back to austerity? I really hope not, because we need those investments. But also, I mean, again, a lot of the fuel of the extreme right is born in austerity measures, is born in breaking down of social policy. And I mean, I now see, for instance, in my own country, conservative parties saying we need to cut costs in our health systems and use that money to then invest in defense. then I have a problem. So it's not that I say like, okay, we're not going to have to invest in defense. I'm not naive. Yes, we will need to do so. We will need to step up our cooperation European-wide, because of course it's not just a question of putting a lump sum of money on the table and then we're all going to be safe from Russia. That's not how it works. I mean, if you now add up all of the budgets on defense of all member states, is 3 times as much as what Russia actually has. So, I mean, for me, I'm open to saying we need to look at the defense budgets, but it's also a question of closer cooperation, of actually making sure that this is something that is interesting also for our European industry, because right now the bulk of the money is going to America. That's where we are buying our weapons. So you need to invest. You need to have the room to invest. You need to have the room to invest both in making the Green Deal more social, but also in making sure, for instance, that our industry makes that transition. And right now, it's not politically possible, it seems, to do what we did during the Corona crisis, namely to go together on the markets and make sure that that money is actually there by loaning together. I think that's something that we are going to need to do to pay for the transition and to also aid industry, because otherwise, well, you know, you see a lot of companies already looking at America, at China, where these support systems are there.
Why do you think it's not politically possible? From your experience, you know, on the front lines of politics itself, where are the blockages?
Well, I think it's quite clear if you look at what happened at the moment where the state aid rules were loosened. It's of course predominantly France and Germany that are using it because they have a lot of deeper pockets, I would say, than the rest of the member states. And it's also Germany and also some of the frugals, of course, like the Netherlands, that are blocking this sort of, you know, RRF 2.0 or however you want to call it. So it's the same rhetoric that we have seen during the economical crisis, for instance. They are afraid that there won't be popular support due to, of course, some of the cliches that are there, like, oh, it's not up to the Germans or the Dutch to pay for the debt in Greece or in Spain, etc. I mean, these kind of cliches, we've seen them, they are still out there. And I mean, for them, that's one of the reasons, I would say, why they are not willing right now to take that next step. But I think it's a political mistake.
And I don't know if you saw the economic news out this morning, but the economic growth in Greece, Italy, Spain and Portugal is currently significantly higher than in Germany. They seem to restore their economies. Can we also restore a kind of, you know, more of a political environment, more willing to engage in these more difficult policy areas? Is there a role, for example, Brooke, for greater citizens' participation, more citizens' assemblies, panels that might provide a more deliberative model for getting over these entrenched ideas?
I think absolutely. I think there is a strong push within the EU, at the EU level, specifically with regard to the Green Deal, to mainstream more of these participatory democracy exercises. And going back to this question of getting people on board, and, you know, citizen inclusion and decision making is a key way to do that, and it's a key way to push the marker on the Green Deal. So whether it's mainstreaming climate assemblies, similar, you know, to the Conference of the Future of Europe, these are all important ways to do so. The challenge, I guess, will be doing so in a way that's not overly institutionalized and bureaucratic, and, you know, maintains the citizen-led democratic feel of it. Is it possible? I think absolutely.
EPC is developing some work in this area, isn't it? Maybe you want to say a bit more about.
So we're doing a project right now with the Sustainable Prosperity for Europe program, and it's specifically on this question of how can we better engage citizens in the green transition. However, it takes a specific angle, which is the use of digital tools to do so, taking into account the fact that digitalization and averting climate change are two, you know, policy priorities of the EU. So as policies progress, these two topics will be more interconnected, and trying to unpack the nexus between digital transition, green transition, and citizens, and understanding how digital tools can, optimize citizen engagement, but also the challenges there. So, like we talked about, participatory democracy exercises. So using digital tools to enable citizens to become more engaged, like we saw with the Conference of the Future of Europe. But it's also the challenges that this poses to citizen engagement. So their privacy, their cybersecurity, issues like this, that really needs to be explored, but is definitely an avenue forwards that will be quite important in the next institutional cycle.
And sometimes we hear from, legislators from various parties. They say, hold on a minute, we're the people who are doing the citizens' participation. We're the people who actually go out and talk to voters. Would you appreciate a bit of competition from more participatory democracy?
Well, I would. I know that some colleagues are more critical on this, but actually in my former job, I was one of the ones negotiating these deliberative panels in the Brussels region, where we were quite cutting edge in that sense, and of course, there's still a difference in role, if you will, for a citizens panel vis-a-vis actually making law. But I do think also within climate, within energy policy, etc., the experiments that we have seen also on a municipal level, for instance, show that it really helps to get public support, and that actually a lot of citizens, if they get this guidance, if they get all the information that is needed, are quite capable of making very good decisions. So I think it's always going to be a bit of a hybrid system there, where the lawmaking is still institutionalized, but that you can, as a lawmaker, be very much inspired by what comes out of one of those citizens panels. And I mean, for instance, in the Brussels region, there's even an obligation to do something with it. I mean, it's not just something, because otherwise people get discouraged. And then there's no point in actually putting your time and effort and free time, if you will, in this kind of process. So for me, I mean, both systems can exist and can be enriching in that sense.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Sara Matthieu. Thank you very much, Brooke Moore. We've had a very interesting and enlightening discussion, and I urge you all to tune in to episode 3 of Policy Crossroads by the EPC. Thank you very much.